I think if we go into this portion first, as part of the president's report, then we'll pick up the remainder of the meeting. I hope we all have a copy of this. There are copies up there. You're not going to have time to read it before or during this portion of the meeting. But we wanted, as an NAACP unit, to discuss that yesterday, May the 14th, was the 60th anniversary of the passage of the ordinance by the Louisville Board of Aldermen that outlawed segregation in public facilities in Louisville. All right. 60 years ago. And yes, I was right. When you look, I just pulled some articles that had been in the Courier Journal and the Louisville Times. I'm sorry, and the Louisville Defender. When you think of Louisville, Kentucky, 1963, wow. Segregation. Public facilities, public restaurants, hotels were segregated. Movie houses were segregated. It really began in 1960 when a gentleman by the name of William W. Beckett, who was an alderman, introduced a public accommodation ordinance that would outlaw segregation in public accommodations. At that time, Beckett was the only African American on the 12-member Board of Aldermen. He couldn't get a second, and they defeated it. That was in 1960. It was about that time that you had the sit-in movement in Greensboro, North Carolina, and began a movement across the nation of college students presenting themselves at the Woolworths. Now, how many of you don't know what Woolworths is? Okay. Okay, you know what Woolworths was, 5 and 10 cent store. Yeah. They presented themselves there and began sitting in. Well, SNCC was formed, and the movement moved from Greensboro to Nashville to Atlanta to Houston. These are places that had HBCUs. Louisville didn't have an HBCU. At that point, I was a senior in high school. I was president of the youth council in NAACP. And we thought that we could do it. The adults were not in favor, not because they didn't agree, but they were afraid of what would happen to us as students. Looking around the room, I see one person who was a student with me, although a couple of years younger. I'm not going to say she was 80. A couple of years younger. who participated in sit-in demonstrations. It was February 1961 when we were sitting in, or standing in really, at the old Stewart's department store on the corner of 4th and then Walnut 4th and now Muhammad Ali. They arrested us. There were 18 of us on the picket on the line that day. When they arrested us and we went back to school the next day, there were 75. The next day, 100. We demonstrated every day after school. We would meet at first at the Chestnut Street YMCA and then walk to 4th Street. Now, remember that 4th Street was the main thoroughfare, business district as well as entertainment. All of the movie houses, first run movie houses were on 4th Street. You had Blue Boar Cafeteria, you had the Brown Hotel, you had the Steelback Hotel, you had Kaufman's, you had Stewart's. These were large department stores. We were able, and there was an article that was published in the Louisville Defender. At one time, Louisville led the nation in arrests for sittings and demonstrations to end segregation. That continued. While the students and young people were demonstrating, the adults were organizing a voter registration drive. That November, well, let's go back to the ordinance. Beckett had again reintroduced the ordinance, and it was again defeated. You had the mayoral election of 1961. The adults organized voter registration. At that point, the Republican candidate was William O. Callagher. The Democratic candidate was William Milburn, who was the principal at Mayo High School. Mr. Milburn was also president of the Board of Aldermen and had voted against public accommodation. Now, the NAACP is and was nonpartisan. But we put the word out not to vote for Milburn. When the election came about that November, the Democratic Party had been in power for 28 years in Louisville, was defeated. And Mr. Callagher had said that he would consider supporting a public accommodation ordinance. Now just a little bit, when you look at Louisville back in 61, 62, 63, there was no McDonald's in Louisville. There was no Holiday Inn in Louisville. There was no Kentucky Fried Chicken. There was the WC Lounge. And we could not go in there and sit. We had to stand. Frisch's was here. But you couldn't go in Frisch's and eat. The one that was out on Cane Run Road, we had to sit in the car and eat. all the bridges, all the ranch houses. Disney, they were all segregated. A group of us went away to school. And we came home that summer. We were picketing Fountain Ferry. The amusement park. The NAACP, Bishop Tucker and Core were supporting and pushing for a public accommodations ordinance continuously. At that point in time, I think you may be disturbing the cameraman. The ice is, and he's moving, so don't disturb the cameraman. The effort to pass a public accommodation ordinance continued. The churches rallied. The community rallied. It was from 1960 until 1963. The election was in November 1961. It still took 2 additional years to get an ordinance passed. As you see, if you look at that first article, it says that the vote was 8-4. So it wasn't unanimous. At that point, there were 2 African Americans on the Board of Aldermen. Now, one thing that happened with the election of '61, although Beckett was African American, or Negro then, he supported and introduced the ordinance. But in order to be a candidate in the Democratic Party, you had to pledge allegiance to the nominees of the party. Therefore, he supported Mr. Miller. And we voted him out. Because of that support. Mr. Beckett was defeated. Ms. Louise Reynolds, who was a real estate agent, was elected. And Russell Lee, another African-American Republican, was elected. So we had 2 votes on that 12-member board. They practiced? Yeah. Yeah.
All right, said.
They were Republicans. I've registered, I don't mind telling you, as a Democrat. That was when the first time the 18-year-olds could vote in 1961. I voted Republican. It's important to realize that with the passage of the ordinance, the Republican Party is different today than it was then. So let's understand that. Partisan politics can be important. I happen to have worked for U.S. Senator for 12 years in Washington. And I came home to vote one year, and at that time we had the old machines where you flipped the lever And my precinct captain was standing outside while I was voting. And she hollered in there, "Stop scratching that ticket." That meant I was splitting. I meant that I was voting Republican, and some Democrats. And I have served as secretary of the state Democratic Party. But I also realize there are some SOBs on both sides. And therefore, you vote your conscience. And as we vote tomorrow, if you haven't already voted, you have to vote in your primary. But come the general election, we vote our interest. That is the important aspect of it. And as important as that ordinance was and is, it did outlaw segregation in Louisville. It put a penalty, and Louisville became the first city in Kentucky, the first city in the South to pass a public accommodations ordinance. And if you notice, it was passed in May of 1963, and the March on Washington was in August of 1963.
Wow.
So as we know that we have some problems in Louisville, we can appreciate and celebrate the passage of that ordinance in 1963. And just to look at today, as you know, Department of Justice was in Louisville last week. They held hearings. Today, on behalf of the Louisville branch NAACP, I filed some open records requests asking the city of Louisville to, one, to release the names of the police officers and the judges who were identified in the DOJ report. It's imperative that we get access to those names and those officers. We also we made a request for the city of Louisville to identify the dates and the places that negotiations with the police department for the new contract will take place. They have denied, the mayor has denied that, or has said that no one can be in there except the police representative in the mayor's office. We disagree with that, and we are asking, one, for the names, the dates and the places. And if and when we get that, we will determine what else we can seek and what our next steps will be. Now, let me say this for you and the media that's here. We realize what negotiations and labor negotiations are. We respect organized labor, but we also believe that in the public interest, the public and the city will best be served with allowing not anyone to participate in the discussions, in the negotiations. But at least have a neutral person in there who can report back to the community what has transpired in those meetings. We would also say it could be a former judge who wasn't named to act as a mediator, not to participate, but to accurately report back to the community as the negotiations are taking place. With that, I think that we all understand the importance of voting, the importance of laws, and the impact that they have on the community. This ordinance that we are observing is probably been forgotten by most people. But we think that it is important enough that we should commemorate it and celebrate it. Because without it, Charlene and I could still be out there demonstrating from 1961 until today. It was, and I think what most people fail to realize during the Civil Rights Movement, sit-ins, stand-ins, and other forms of demonstrations were a tactic. They were tactics. They were designed, or they drew the public attention. Think of what happened when John Lewis and them tried to cross the Pettus Bridge. The dogs in Alabama. Those movements drew attention. But it took the enactment of laws. They went hand in hand. We demonstrated, we agitated, and we voted. And that's the lesson, I think, of that shows what can be accomplished by throwing out the Democratic Party in '61, electing the Republican Party in '61, and then throwing that daggone Republican Party out in '67.
Yeah, I heard about that.
That we did with open housing demonstrations. We threw them out and elected Democrats. So, it's not party, it's principle. It's not party, it is the issues. And with that, I'm going to end my part of this presentation and ask, are there any questions?